Hello and welcome to the first episode of the Bristol Radical History podcast. My name is Chris Bowkett and I'll be interviewing Silu Pascoe, who is the author of the 1963 Bristol Bus Boycott. First of all, Silu, can you tell us how you got involved with the Bristol Radical History Group?
Well, I first got involved in the group because they did a series of events in 2007 to do with the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade. So I went along to those events. I hadn't heard of the group before, but was so interested in what was happening. That's when I that's when I joined.
Okay. So can you tell us how you came to do some research on the Bristol Bus Boycott?
Well, the Bristol Radical History Group do these annual history festivals. And in 2023, I already was aware that it was the 60th anniversary of the Bristol Bus Boycott campaign. And when I learned that one of the themes for our history festival was about trade unions, I thought it would be a really good idea to do something about the Bristol Bus Boycott because the campaigners were having to struggle for rights during that time, not only against the Bristol Omnibus Company, but also the trade union at the time, that was the Transport and General Workers Union.
Today's Unite,
So
isn't it?
that's what got me involved in wanting to write it, to talk about it first, to research it. I don't think at that point I'd had any intention of writing it. But, and I also knew Madge Dresser, and I knew that she had written about, but at that time I was thinking she might do it, but unfortunately she wasn't so well. So the group asked me if I would do it, so I said yes.
Were people at the festival? Were people surprised on the more negative view of trade unions involved in the bus boycott?
I think it told people something that they hadn't been so aware of, that in fact, because the trade union and the bus company went to and fro with each other, blaming each other, I think that made people more aware. I think they thought it was just the bus company. So they were surprised at that time because, of course, at that time also, trade unions professed about the brotherhood of man and everybody being equal. So I don't think people had necessarily thought that the union was so institutionally racist at the time.
There was something that surprised me when reading the pamphlet, and it was you have to correct me on the year. I think it was 1956 or 1957 was the first time that in the TUC General Council they actually mentioned racism or racial discrimination.
You're absolutely right, and that was at the national level, of course. So this is, in a sense, when things were, in theory, the beliefs and values of the trade union were being discussed and being making statements about. So, as you said, it was clear that there were issues, and I think that's why, to me, it was important about the context of the times, about what was going on, and that a lot of people in the Caribbean had got experience of trade unions in their own countries, being British colonies.
Yeah, it's all very well saying international workers of the world, but if you're doing the racism at home, it doesn't quite. It sounds quite hollow, doesn't it?
Not living up to that ideal. And I think also what to me was important was that because you had to belong to the union to be able to be employed by the bus company, that made it much more real as to what people were facing, because the workers themselves were saying, we don't want to work with black drivers and black conductors.
I read as well that there was almost a distinction between the Bristol Omnibus Company and then the Bath one, which I think was a subsidiary of the Bristol one.
Yeah, that was also very important because going back to what the trade unions were saying nationally, so they were assuming the TUC, that all the unions, especially the Transport and General Workers Union, which was a very big union, that all the branches were adhering to the national policy. So it was a surprise, basically, that the Bristol, even within the union at the bus company, operated in a different way. So the maintenance members were used to working with black workers in the maintenance depot and in the canteen, but the drivers and conductors part of the union had already said, no, we don't want them being employed. So right within not only the branch, but even within the branch, there were these differences that were not in line with the national policy.
What do you think? I'm trying to phrase the question in the right way, but I notice as well, it's, when reading the pamphlet, there's a real, you can see the connections with the US and the American civil rights experience. I guess I'd like you just to kind of speak to that difference from 1963, but also, if you can, how it's almost remembered today in different ways.
I think one of the things that struck me was that Paul Stevenson had said he was inspired by the bus boycott, the Montgomery bus boycott,
56 or
that had taken place in the 50s. He felt inspired by that, which is why he with the group of activists, decided to call their own bus boycott within Bristol. But what was very obvious at the time was the American civil rights was going on at the same time. So there were various other protests, marches, bus boycotts in the States that were being quoted in the UK, especially in Bristol. So they were making the point that all this was going on in the States and how terrible that people were having to have this struggle for racial justice, but then operating in the same way and being racist in Bristol. I think the other thing that was very apparent was, in terms of the civil rights movement in America, was they themselves, especially Martin Luther King, had said, we're influenced by what's going on in other parts of the world where colonies, European colonies, were fighting for their independence. So here were things happening all over the world. And in South Africa, of course, they still were. And these events were being quoted in Bristol by various people, and like, well, we don't want apartheid here in Bristol. And, you know, how awful that the union is sticking up for black people in South Africa, but they're operating, you know, in a racist way here in Bristol.
I want to just kind of talk about, if you could, the way that the Bristol Bus Boycott is remembered or studied today in Bristol. Because I'm aware you've been into a few schools and spoken about it there. What's the reaction that you received by students in Bristol to the fact that such an important campaign happened in Bristol?
I think it was very interesting because 2023 was the 60th anniversary. When I gave the talk at the annual History Festival, a man who I didn't know, who I do now, called Jules, had come to that talk. And he came up to me afterwards and said, I'm having a number of events in Bristol for the 60th anniversary because I believe that this campaign, this bus boycott campaign, hasn't been remembered in a way that it ought to be. And even at the 50th anniversary, they'd had something, but not a lot. So his idea was very much to raise the profile of the importance of this event by having various events. And that's how I met Joyce, who's the co-author of the pamphlet, because she'd also become involved in these events. And I, of course, learned not only that she'd been involved in the campaign. And talking with her made me realise that, yes, it had been under-recognised in terms of British civil rights movement. So everybody knows about Rosa Parks and the American civil rights movement and Martin Luther King. But certainly Joyce and I found when we went into schools, the children didn't know that this event had happened in their own city.
I think that's also quite striking, and this came out when we had our initial conversation before this interview, was that, you know, even the book by Madge Dresser, Black and White on the Buses, in, was it 1986? It took Madge Dresser as an American. It took an American to write something on the Bristol Bus Boycott.
And I think that's very, very interesting. That's what struck me, Chris, because I had been influenced and I'd read Madge's book, I'd met Madge, and I thought how interesting that a white American comes to Bristol when, of course, the American civil rights movement, and she obviously knew a lot about that coming from America. It took her to write something about the Bristol Bus Boycott campaign, because although Paul and Roy and various people had clearly talked about things about that event in Bristol, not really very much had been made about it. So in a way, it was a forgotten. And it seemed interesting because Madge, of course, spoke to Paul and Roy, that it took, as you said, an American to be able to write about the event happening in Bristol. And what struck me about that was, in talking with Madge, when I thought she might be the person to give the talk at the festival, was that's partly why I was determined to, in a sense, raise the profile of the Black people that had been involved in the campaign, because the students had helped. There were white allies. But if you looked at the papers, you would not be so conscious of how many Black activists were part of that campaign, because you tended, if at all, to see photos of the leaders like Paul, but you certainly didn't see women. You certainly didn't see the other activists who clearly were involved in the photographs in the newspapers. So I think one of the enduring images is of the students, the Bristol students as white allies, walking down Park Street. There were a few Black students, but mainly white students. But that's an iconic image of the Bristol.
I think what was quite interesting, I think it was it perhaps was for the 60th anniversary. I know the BBC did a few interviews. They had the regional secretary of Unite giving a formal apology and all that sort of thing. And I was struck watching the older clips from 1963, quite how well spoken Paul Stevenson was. And was there an active choice to have such incredibly well spoken?
I think it's very interesting that Paul, who had come to Bristol as a youth leader, obviously was meeting a number of youngsters in Bristol that he was helping. And when these African Caribbean young men were talking about wanting to do something, he was an obvious choice. I think also interesting that he helped Guy get the interview in the first place by ringing up. And of course, he was very well spoken. So imagine their surprise then when, as Guy told me, he turned up for the interview. They said, "Oh, no." He said, "I've come for my interview." They said, "No, we're waiting for a Mr. Bailey. He's coming." And he said, "I am Mr. Bailey." And so you're right. There was a conscious choice about Paul being the coordinator, the leader of the group, and of course gave a lot of speeches around Bristol as part of the campaign. And he was, in a sense, the face of the campaign for that reason. So when he was interviewed by the press. But you see, I think it's also interesting that when Ron Nethercutt made these
He was the
aspersions, allegations against Paul in terms of questioning him, getting everybody wound up about things, that Paul did what I think would have been unexpected at the time. He took the newspaper and Ron to court. And again, I'm sure spoke very eloquently for his case.
And Nethercutt was the branch.
Oh, sorry. Yes, he was the regional secretary for the TGW. Yeah.
Yeah.
So he was the one that had already had contact with some of the other people in Bristol. And part of the difficulty, I think, was he obviously was meeting with local branch members, but he was finding that, in fact, what he was saying wasn't necessarily what the local branch members wanted him to say. So I think he felt a bit under siege anyway.
In terms of the libel case that was put, I think it was against the Daily Herald.
It was the Labour Party.
Exactly,
yeah.
Against the Daily Herald, and it was against Ron Nethercutt as well.
Yeah.
Do you know the circumstances of why it was brought about in the first place, how it was funded? Because I can imagine such a thing was quite expensive to do at the time.
I know that because Ron had written the Daily Herald had written what Ron had accused Paul of, because there was a mixture of views within the black residents of Bristol about the boycott. And I think what Ron, in a sense, was trying to suggest was that Paul was an agitator and getting people, whereas there were some black people who were wanting to calm the waters and say, oh, yes, I'm sure we'll get there at some point, but we're a more gradualist an approach. So with him getting the Daily Herald writing how much Paul was an agitator meant, of course, that Paul felt very strongly. I don't know how his case was funded, but he certainly took them to court.
Yeah, I mean, there was one part of the pamphlet that really, it's obviously a very inspiring story. But there's one thing that really made me laugh, and it was the idea of all the activists turning up outside St Mary Redcliffe, hundreds of them outside to kind of greet the parishioners as they come outside. I thought it was a fantastic image.
Yes, and I think Joyce might say more about that. But I think what was also interesting, to go back to that, was when you spoke to me about the Bath group. See, at one point, Paul spoke and said, I cannot understand how black people can't get jobs as drivers and conductors here in Bristol when the same bus company in Bath employs them as drivers and conductors. So as a result of that speech, that the activists decided to march to the church, and basically that was a large group of black people saying, yes, this just seems ridiculous, that we can't get jobs in Bristol. And so I think that also was important in the sense of history, that was probably the first largest group of black activists around employment ever. So it was a really important event in terms of their organizer, and the fact that they were organising in different ways.
Do you think that's one of the things that makes the Bristol Bus Boycott campaign really kind of stand out from other kind of contemporary campaigns at the time in Britain?
There were some other activity I've later learned, because clearly London transport was a very big, and in some of the cities like Wolverhampton. But I think the importance of the Bristol one was it was very organised in the sense that it was more than one thing.
I wanted to ask as well about the almost the formal and informal organisations around the bus boycott. So what was because I'm aware that Paul Stevenson was the spokesperson for the West Indian Development Council.
Correct.
I'll repeat that again: West Indian Development Council.
Yes.
What was their role in the boycott? Did they purposely choose a test case? What was their, I guess, remit? Is probably the best word.
Well, because they already had a grievance, this group of young black men seeking jobs in Bristol, there were already grievances about the racism they were finding in getting jobs. But the issue with the bus company was it was one of the biggest employers. And so, as quite rightly, they were saying, well, we're paying our money to go on these buses. A number of black people ride these buses. Why aren't we getting, jobs on the buses? So they, in a sense, were already discussing, we want to do something. They then made a conscious decision, because, of course, a lot of them knew Paul through the youth work he was doing, to discuss what could they do about it. They wanted something done about it. And Paul, of course, agreed with them. He was very much in line with saying, well, this needs to be challenged, what's going on. So they formed the West Indian Development Council, partly because they had already approached their local union person and black person who had a much more gradualist approach. So they were disappointed by, we'll get there in time. So there was a conscious decision. So although they're known as the leaders, clearly there were meetings of a bigger number of activists who said, yes, we want to do something. And that's when the tactics were discussed. And Paul said, well, I feel inspired by this American bus boycott. But I think the importance of the Bristol one was how much they strategically were seeking white allies, were going outside Bristol, making contact with national, the senior management of the bus company, the senior union, people like Frank Cousins, but they also were seeking other black allies like Saliri Constantine. And so from their point of view, the major focus was the bus boycott, the sit-ins, the marches, the speeches, and use of the local press as to putting forward their case, saying this needed to...
Could you repeat that bit? Sorry.
So it was part of a wider strategy in terms of the group. So there were the meetings, and I can remember Barbara Detherin telling me, she often went to these meetings where they were discussing what they were going to do and where they were going to do it. And I don't know, I don't think I've ever really discussed this with Joyce, but I had the impression that Roy Hackett, I had met Roy, but I'd never asked him this. He was much more a tactician in the sense of organising the routes of the marches, the sit-ins at the depots, and his emphasis on the fact it had to be non-violent, just like in America. So it was direct action, but it was non-violent. And Roy talked about, how mums and prams, when they drop their children to school, would come along and say, well, what's going on? So involving people in a way, talking to them about what the issues were that they were campaigning for.
Were there any links between the West Indian Development Council and other political groups?
Through Paul, the link was because of Tony Benn, the local MP, the Labour MP, who in fact was the opposition spokesman for transport. The links were made locally with Tony Benn, who supported the campaign, and Harold Wilson, who was the opposition leader at the time. So there was links with the Labour Party. There weren't links locally with any other political parties, but I know that Marples, who was the Tory Minister for Transport, was approached about the boycott because he was surprised, or seemingly surprised, that there was this racist policy going on in Bristol. So there were white allies in the sense of the students. There were other white supporters. I mean, I very recently, last year, met a man through another project I'm involved with who said he remembered being pushed in his pram. This is a white man, being pushed in his pram by his mother, who said, "I'm not traveling on the bus, I'm supporting the campaign." So there was, as I said, certainly support, but more in that way rather than organised other groups.
Yeah. The reason I ask that is because I remember reading in the pamphlet how the Bristol Trades Council, they strongly criticised the transport
Very good
union.
point. Yes, you are right. Because of this link, yes, you're quite right,
I just wondered whether there was a more
because
formal...
of May Day. Absolutely, you're right. Because of course, Nethercott and the other union people were coming under more pressure because of the May Day event. You're quite right. The Trades Council and other union people were critical of the Transport and General Workers Union. You're right. So at their May Day event, they formally were saying to them, this is not right.
What sources did you use to research the pamphlet?
But when I came to research it, I'd already read Madge's account, black and white on the buses. And through reading that, of course, I realised there'd been a lot of local black, about the black activity in the press about this campaign. So my first source was, I thought, all right, I'll go to the newspapers, the Western Daily Press and the Evening Post, and see if all this coverage is in their archives, only to be told that there isn't that coverage in the archives. So I did go to Bristol Archives because I knew Paul had lodged his archives there. And I went to the reference library where another member of our group, Dawn Dyer, I approached Dawn, who'd been helpful to me on other things I've been doing. And I said, "What have you got, if anything, on the Bristol Bus Boycott?" She said, "Oh, well, there is this book of cuttings, newspaper cuttings." I said, "Brilliant, that's what I'm after." She said, you have to read it here, it's in the reference library. Imagine my surprise then when I said to Dawn, "So who who made this book of cuttings?" So she said, "Well, I did." I said, "Well, that just proves my point. It's important who decides what's kept and who decides what's not kept about an event." Because, of course, that was a major source to find out about what actually happened at the time. But I was fortunate too in that by the time I was researching, I hadn't met Joyce, I hadn't met Guy when I was researching for the talk. But then when Joyce and I were giving various talks, people said, "Well, why don't you write it up?" So I hadn't thought of writing it up. I don't think Joyce had either. I'll ask her about that further. But what it then said to me was, yes, I had done this research about it. I had, by then when I was writing, I'd met Guy, spoken to Guy a lot more about his account. I've met people like Barbara. Crucially, I've met Joyce. So it confirmed to me what I always knew, that women were there as active. So the different sources then came in after my original talk that made me think, yes, it is important to record this. So that's why in writing it, I was drawing on both oral testimonies, newspaper accounts, and the key secondary source, which was Madge's account. But also bringing it up to date in a sense because of the 60th anniversary, about its importance, about how it's been forgotten, but how the 60th anniversary, in a sense, made more people aware of this event. And so by writing about it too, because I knew that our publications are lodged, aren't they, in the British Library?
I believe so. I think that's the intention, isn't it, for all of them?
So I thought, well, yes, that would be one way that Joyce and our account can be also, we hoped that more people would read about it, having not been so aware of this event in British history.
Yeah, I mean, I find it interesting if I can talk about it in a personal way. I mean, if I look back at when I studied history at school, I find it really interesting that when I was at school, so in mid 2000s, I guess, I find it interesting that at my school there's a really, really big focus on American civil rights. And I didn't know anything about the Bristol Bus Boycott. In fact, the first time I heard about the Bristol Bus Boycott was when I eventually moved to Bristol, and I think possibly I saw this pamphlet. And this is, I say as I'm someone who I think I'm quite good at history, something I'm very interested in, and I find it quite striking in a way that, that's the first, I guess, the first relationship I had with it.
And it's interesting because when Joyce and I have given talks, and we have given a number of talks, the number of people that come up afterwards and say, you've given us more detail about what actually happened than we ever knew. And so, as you said, there's certainly not even being Bristolians have they learnt about it at school, which to me was surprising, but perhaps not so, because always the focus is on the American civil rights movement, not the British one. And so in a way, that's what made me think initially it is important to get it written down, but also to bring it up to date, because sadly, the campaign had an influence on legislation, but what we're so aware of is that there's racism still around. It may not be so overt, so although we've got legislation, it's there. And very conscious in 2024, because I'm a volunteer teacher with asylum seekers and refugees, when we had the riots and protests here in Bristol, which again were racist in nature, what struck me was talking to people like Joyce, how it brought it back, their experiences in the 60s of the overt racism that had been around then. So the sad thing in a way was, goodness, all these years later, and we've still got those issues. But in terms of the activists, to think that for them revived those memories of when it was so overt. So welcome, Joyce, to what is the Bristol Radical History Group's first podcast.
Thank you for having me here.
And perhaps we could start off before we say how we met each other and how we got involved in the Bus Boycott publication, was by you introducing yourself. Just say a little bit about yourself before we start.
I'm Joyce Morris-Wisdom. I was 14 years of age when I joined the Bristol 1963 bus boycott.
Okay. So if I can come in right away then about how I met you and learnt that you were only 14 years old. Said earlier with Chris that I gave this talk about the Bristol Bus Boycott at our annual history festival in 2023. And at a subsequent event I was invited to about the Bristol Bus Boycott, you were there. And at that time, I knew that there must have been women involved in this bus boycott campaign, but I'd never met any. And at that time, you were given, I think, about 3 minutes to say how you were involved. But I remember coming up to you afterwards and learning a lot more about your involvement, but also the importance of your involvement in the campaign. So my first question to you is about who and what influenced you to become involved in the bus boycott, but also then to subsequently write your account.
I was influenced by Bristol First African Caribbean youth worker, which is Dr. Paul Stevenson, OBE. And also because of my strong belief in social justice, fairness, and equality, including the fact that I was concerned and worried that when I leave school, although I was 14 at the time, that within 2 years of that, I would have experienced the same thing as Guy Bailey, Dr. Guy Bailey, as he is at the moment. And I thought it was best to be in something that will change the course of history. It may never happen again.
So with you knowing Paul Stevenson, am I correct in that you went to the youth club that he ran, but he also knew your parents?
Yes. The youth club, which is connected to Baptist Mills Secondary Modern School. I was a member there, and I was helping out in the tuck shop selling refreshments, and that is where Paul and I, with a group of my other schoolmates, talked about how we're getting on, what would we like to do, etc. And then when the opportunity came for us to do a course, I volunteered that I would do the course to become a qualified youth leader, and that is where it started from.
Right. Okay. So take us forward a bit in terms of what made you think, yes, I actually do want to join what would be marches, sit-ins, talks about what was going on and why it was important to you to take part in the... You were only 14, and if I remember, you had to get permission off school even to...
Yes, that's correct. Well, being my mom, because of the prominent position she had within the community as a treasurer of the partner, she knew Paul, Roy, and his wife, and Audley, and Owen Henry, and a lot of other people. And her and Ina Hackett were close friends.
Right.
And when it was mentioned, Ina mentioned it to my mom to say what had happened, what's taking place, that was she able to join them on the march. My mom couldn't because of work commitments, so I wanted to be part of it. I was very nervous, petrified, shy, worried, but I felt I was mature enough and desperately wanted to. So I asked my mom's permission. Eventually, she said yes, but then I had to approach a school as well. So both my mom and I approached the school to get permission that I could be off, that they didn't think I was skiving off school, doing truancy. not that I would, but that's how it had to be.
It was important in those days, as you said, get permission.
So I got permission to do so, and obviously when it was all arranged, I decided that this is my chance. Looking back on it, my mom must have been going out of her head thinking, will I be safe? But then her friends, the group, decided, like Ina and Roy and lots of other people, saying to her that we'll look after her. So the agreement was kept that I would go, they'd keep a close eye on me, and I wouldn't be too exposed. Being exposed, me not in the front of it, because there was police and horses, and not at the end either, but was on the inner part, because we don't know how we would be received.
I think you were also very aware of the pictures that you've seen on the television that was going on in America with the American civil rights movement and the reaction of some of the public towards people there. So I can imagine why you had these mixed feelings.
Yes.
Joyce, let's fast forward. And as I said, I met you in 2023, and together we got quite involved in a number of activities raising awareness of the Bristol Bus Boycott.
That's correct, yes.
What brought you to feeling, yes, I'm actually going to write about it? You've spoken about it. We've been into schools. And here was I saying to you, Joyce, we're being asked at several events, are we going to write it?
Well, after having met you at the 60th anniversary of the Bristol boycott, Jules Davis at Curiosity Limited was the disruptor in chief. You and I got talking, and we went to various schools and had a discussion after I met you about my involvement, etc. I decided, obviously, and I put it to you, and we've agreed that I wanted to be part of writing the booklet because we're a joint author. And that was because I wanted to have my experience written down. That would be for the purpose of my children, grandchildren, and great grandchildren, and also for my parents, because something which was a watershed moment needed to be documented for not just my family, but other children and future generation.
And I believe, Joyce, you feel very strongly about the fact that everybody knows about Rosa Parks and the American boycott, but here you were finding school children who didn't know what had happened in their own city. And your feeling about it should be on the national curriculum. We now hear that it could well be it's been recommended that it is. Yeah. So what are your feelings about that? Are you pleased to feel that, yes, my wish is actually going to come true? Or
I'm really pleased about it indeed, but I'm still waiting to see it. Even though I've gone to Parliament to have a look at the act which came from the peaceful event march, and Sir Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of the Labour Party, and it's been discussed, and I understand that King Charles have actually mentioned it as well. It's not going to be for another 2 years, I think, which is a very long time, taking into consideration how many years ago that this watershed event had happened, because it's not a Black History Month history, it's not a African Caribbean history, it's a British history. And I strongly believe that it should have been taught in school already. So with the letter from Keir Starmer saying that it's going to be done for it to be in the school national curriculum, I think haven't come soon enough. So yes, I'm very pleased indeed. And the result of that so far, because I feel within myself, it's about social justice for everyone and equality. And the impossible became the possible. It's also put Bristol firmly on the map, and Bristol is an iconic city.
I think the other thing that you felt very strongly about, Joyce, was telling the women's story about this. And I wondered if you'd like to say a little bit about that, because a lot came out in 2023 about the fact, yes, there were women involved in this campaign that people were not aware of. Would you like to say a little bit about what you got involved with, including making a film?
Yes, the fact that we hear about America's civil rights movement and Rosa Parks, there's nothing being said about the Bristol boycott here. Say, for example, we don't hear much about what women have done. And like Claudette Colvin, who went for the same reason as Rosa Parks, we don't hear about her. It's like she hasn't existed. Yet it was Rosa's name we hear about. And here in Bristol, before Guy Bailey, Ina Hackett, Roy Hackett's wife, wanted a job all the time as a bus conductress. She didn't, her name is never mentioned either. And unlike myself, it's very rarely that my name has been mentioned, even though I took time out of school and took part and was petrified, not even realizing how dangerous it was at the time for myself and at that age. So I think what has happened that there's been hidden history historically all over the world that women are put on the not seen, we're not there, we've never done anything, which isn't true. And I've taken part in many things. One of the other things that I've done is from the Bristol Bus Boycott, a theatrical company, which is Birmingham Hippodrome
To the street?
theater, yes, called To the Street. What they've done is asked from me. They wanted a story from a female perspective, and not just a female, but somebody of African descent, Caribbean descendant. And I was really pleased when they asked me to do that. And I've actually gone and see the theatrical play twice. And I was also chosen as the...
But I think you're hoping that will come to Bristol at some point.
Yes. As not the leading role, but somewhere where you have to start the story from as to why it happened. That I'm really pleased about. But we're still waiting for it to come to Bristol. It's not been to Bristol, it's been in the Midlands, it's been in London. And for some unknown reason, again, I think it could have something to do with a bit of people's color, because I'm sure there are lots of people here in this country who's got lots of money who could actually fund it, but they've not done so. And maybe it's because it's connected to Bristol. So yes, I'm really pleased about that. But I'm still waiting for that to happen.
And tell me how you got involved in Unite making a film about the women. Because I think we perhaps ought to explain that Unite is the successor union to the Transport and General Workers. And on the 50th anniversary, they actually formally apologised for the behaviour of the union members back in 1963 or that era. But I know that some of especially perhaps the black members of Unite, were feeling very strongly about having recognition of the fact of what had taken place in 63, but more especially about the women who'd been involved.
Yes. At first, when they had this in Birmingham,
you had the award ceremony.
I had the award ceremony, and I was really pleased to accept that, and it was accepted on behalf of not just myself, but all the other pioneers, including women. And we had the Hidden Voices. Unite the Union then decided to do Hidden Voices to emphasize and show the importance that things were historical things where women have done a lot. It's not been known. It's like it's not happened. So I did a video interview with 2 other ladies as well. And that's been showed many a times to different groups of people, sometimes young people, sometimes adults only, and a mixture of what it was like, given our own personal experience of what had happened and how we felt at the time.
So, Joyce, my final question to you is, having taken part at such a young age in this important civil rights campaign, how did it affect the rest of your life? And did it influence the career that you went into?
Having taken part in the Bristol Bus Boycott at the age of 14, it has influenced me and changed the rest of my life in the sense that I still continue to do a lot in the community and to work for things to progress. For example, I worked as a civil servant, obviously, after I've left school. I did social work. I did DHSS, which was then Department of Health and Social Security, which is now Department of Health and Social Care. I did probation, and I did National Public Administration and a social worker. And that had helped me to continue to remember how my parents had taught me, to remember to accept people, that everyone is equal in this world.
I think what's important too, and you're being modest, is in fact you were one of the first Black female social workers.
Yeah.
But I think one of the things you were telling me when you were training, you actually had to do a placement in an area that was all white in Bristol.
Yes. After having completed, successfully completing the social work, almost finished starting it, I wanted to do it in Easton, connected to the Bean Streets. But I was told, explained by Paul Stevenson and these other workers, that it can't be done because you can't do a training within your area. And I had to do my training in Witherwood, which was really rife in those days with racism, and that I'd be looked after. And I must admit, the 2 experienced social workers, they actually took me there to Witherwood and bring me back and sort of keep an eye out to make sure that I was all right, because I was quite young then and being a female. And that's how I had to do the course. And eventually, obviously, I successfully completed it. And then after that, come back into what I called my own area at the time. Although it wasn't mine, it's everybody's area. It's everybody's area, and work there.
That's where you worked, as you said, in the area. I guess part of what I was also thinking about how you were affected is, and Chris asked me, about how the bus boycott in a way has been remembered or not remembered. Because I know prior to 2023, when it was the 60th anniversary, you had tried to keep it alive in people's consciousness by being involved in some other events. Do you want to say about the fact of the plaque in the bus and coach station? Because Mike Baker, you were involved with Mike with that, weren't you?
Yes. Have been involved as well with Mike Baker and continuously with the Bristol Bus Boycott. We didn't hear much about it. And I was invited to the plaque, to the unveiling of the plaque in the Bristol
coach station.
station.
Yeah.
And which was really nice looking at it, but thinking back on it as well, it shows only 5 men, which at the time I didn't know what to say or how to ask. Why is it only 5 men, not 6, and why just 6 men, why couldn't it be done differently? Because we women were involved as well. It wasn't just 5 or 6 men. We went to meeting. We supported decision making, and we continue to remember that it had to be peaceful, what we had to do. So that I'm still puzzled as to the reason why, but I dare say there's got to be some meaning behind it. And I think it could be more publicized on a yearly basis. It shouldn't be a part of just because saying it would be nice and I'd like to see it in school, and it should be there already. But I think more can be done. It could be a public holiday to be remembered, or we could have like a museum donated specifically for that. But it's just seemed to be left maybe by the wayside or not where it should be after all these years. It's like it only happened yesterday.
But as you said, it was so important as part of the British civil rights movement. We don't call it that, but as you said, it was part of that. I suppose the thing for me was that it was a very proactive campaign in the sense of you all discussing what you were going to do at a time where maybe in the news people had heard about the Notting Hill riots and the Nottingham riots, which were being portrayed very, very negatively in the press. I often wondered whether you had a view about how it was portrayed in the press at the time, but also whether you feel, because it was a good example of Black people campaigning for racial justice, maybe it's not so well remembered here because people tend to think, oh, the problems were in America, not here. I wonder if you had a view about that.
Yes.
Clearly, it wasn't easy to go out on the streets. No. You weren't sure how you were going to be received.
Yeah. The press portrayed it as nothing really. It's trivial for them. Well, it might seem trivial, but it wasn't trivial for myself.
No, exactly.
As a young person, other people. In particular, we had the Teddy Boys who was always out ready for a fight, whoever they can fight. And we didn't even know when we would be safe and not being safe. And I personally, I had like lots of friends. The European friends that lived very near. I still got my schoolmates still living on the same street as I did. And my African Caribbean friends that if it was late going, they lived a bit further, I wouldn't go home with them because I thought, well, if I was going to be attacked, I'd run home with the European friends so we could scatter and I'd get home safely, which luckily enough, nothing like that didn't happen. And it always tend to feel unsafe. And they didn't seem so bothered about how they could make things better. Learn to accept people as they are. We're all human beings, whether we like it or not, and we've all got to share the world. And, what also is quite worrying bringing it back is, I think you yourself may have mentioned it earlier, is it 2024 when they had that disagreement here in Bristol?
Yeah.
I was meant to, I think, meet you and a colleague of yours, and I decided I am not going out, and I did not go out for about a week because I was scared. And even though I'm older and wiser, at the same time, I don't think I could have run fast as when I was younger. So I think I felt safer inside. And I think the press have done more harm than good, but they've also they're good in the way that because they publicize it, it made it known a bit more. And for that reason, not just like MP Anthony Wedgwood Ben, but also the, the university students who were there to support us as well. So yes, and for other people who actually didn't go out and march, they were supporters as well, and they could have done more for what they've done, take notes, learn to understand people. It's like the war. They've said nothing about people who are African descendant have helped in any way. And as far as what harm did that do? So what harm would it have done to employ somebody to give them a better quality of life? Because if you don't work, how are you going to survive?